welcome to the Dr. Pete Goldman Show. I'm super psyched to interview Douglas Century, and I'll tell you how I found him. But first of all, Douglas, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Doctor. Should I call you Doctor or Pete?
Pete. Should I call you Doug or Douglas?
As an author, I'm Douglas, but so if you want to go to my website, Douglas Century, but please call me Doug. Everybody calls me Doug.
So Doug, let me tell everyone how I found you. I have always been I've been a martial artist and fighter since I'm 10 years old, and I like to box here and there. And one of the best books I ever read, which you as an author probably heard of it, it's called In This Corner by Peter Heller. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but great book. I think I've reread that book about 8 times, which is uncommon for me to read a book twice, 3 times. I think I've read it cover to cover 8 times. It's a great book about boxing and boxers. And there's another great book called The Saga of the Fist about boxing history. So I've always been interested in boxing history. And I recently saw your book about Barney Ross, and I bought it. I read it cover to cover. And I said, man, this guy is a great author. I just kind of thanked you in the ether waves. And then I said, maybe I can contact him. Maybe I could interview him on my show. And I contacted you, and you were nice enough to come on the show. So thank you for that. And on top of that, we have a lot of other common interests, which we'll get into momentarily, whether it's the Russian Mafia, the Italian Mafia, old-time boxing, old-time Jewish boxers like Barney Ross, hip hop, like some of your other books have been about. So we have a lot of cool stuff to discuss. Let me kick it off with the Mafia, if that's okay.
Well, you're a Brooklyn guy, so that's right over home plate. So I've written about the Italians, the Russians, actually pretty much every Israelis. There's some real serious organized crime in Israel. So yeah, that's a specialty that I kind of fell into, and I think I would consider myself an expert, but I actually know guys in that life. So
here's the first question. What happened from, we'll call it the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s? Those, I'm not even talking about Al Capone in the 20s and that. Just the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when the Mafia was very violent. John Gotti, Sammy the Bull. I'm just talking about the Gambino family, not even the Lucchese's and the Colombos and the other 5 families of New York. But nowadays, the Mafia in New York, there's much less killing, or it appears to be much less killing. It seemed like to kill someone in the Mafia was just par for the course in the John Gotti era and things like that. And of course, even before him, the Sonny Franchise, all that stuff. Why do you think in 2023, the New York Mafia seems to be a more gentle mafia? Is that because of the, what was that, the RICO Act? Is that because of the RICO Act, or is it something else?
Well, yeah, and they're very diminished in terms of, I wrote a book called Takedown, which is about a cop who infiltrated the garbage rackets. And that was $1 billion plus industry. They're still in things like concrete, but my understanding is, and I know a few people, a lot of it's just back to the illegal gambling, the old school bread and butter. So they've lost a lot of their power. But no, there's still, if you read the Daily News, there was a connected guy, wasn't a big guy, killed up, I think in Westchester, the Bronx. A blood whacked him, I think, at a McDonald's or something. So you still hear about like hits, definitely. But I just think the Italian Mafia isn't, it isn't what it used to be at all. You have all these reality shows of families of the Mafia. That didn't used to exist. Nobody fucking talked. Sorry, I don't.
You can curse as much.
It's just talking about the mob. Michael Francesi was nice enough to give me a blurb for my Russian mob book, but you got Michael Francesi, you got Sammy the Bull, you got all these guys. It was a closed society. And Sammy the Bull was a serial killer. If you read, if you really know about those 19 murders, and there were more, it was usually guys, he was just greedy. He was in business with guys, and sometimes just easier to take him out. And also John Gotti was trigger happy, right? But Gotti was afraid of the chin. Chin Gigante was the power in New York. And he was so smart because for years, like, you know, he played crazy and he had Fat Tony Salerno as the front boss. So, you know, you see these documentaries where they go, the boss of the Genovese family was Fat Tony Salerno up in, you know, East Harlem, you know, Pleasant Avenue. He never was. Chin was. So the Ivy League of the Bob is the Genovese crime family. Yeah, and you don't really hear about murders unless it's necessary, right? Because it's bad. It's just a bad look. I mean, it brings heat.
You know, it's interesting. I think Sammy the Bull said that after Frankie DeChico got killed, which was supposedly, I think they thought Chin put that hit.
Yeah.
Apparently trying to get John Gotti, but Frankie DeChico just happened to go to the car, something like that.
Yeah.
I think John Gotti asked Sammy to take out Chin, but that was right before Sammy cooperated. So
yeah. Well, it was a crazy guy that I've written a lot about, Gas Pipe Queso of the Lucchese's, and you know, Gotti broke a cardinal rule of the commission, which was, you know, whack a boss without the commission knowing about it. And it was bad. You know, that was a bad move. I mean, on his part. So right? Yeah, when he killed Castellano. So that was a rule, and yeah, they had a remote controlled bomb. They wanted to make it look like it was Sicilians because the Italian mafia doesn't really generally use bombs. But yeah, they had like a little toy, you know, before drones. Yeah, and they blew up a guy that looked like Gotti, but wasn't. But yeah, they were trying to discipline him, and you know, cops have told me, you know, Gotti was really afraid of the Chin. You know, he had a lot of bravado and shit, but Chin was an old school gangster and he followed these rules. But yeah, there was one commission meeting. Sammy's talked about it. What's the guy's name? He was the head of the Gambino squad for the FBI.
I think were they twins?
Yeah. No, I just can't remember this guy's name right now. But Peter. But he told me there was this commission meeting where John Gotti comes in and he says, you know, I'm proposing my son's made now or whatever, right? And Chin goes, I'm very sorry for you. Because Chin had sons, right? But he never, once you're made in the mafia, you're on a chart, you know, for the FBI. So it's, you know, why would you doom your son who wasn't cut out for that life, right? So Chin was a smarter gangster. Gotti gets all the headlines because the Flash, I mean, this was a guy that got his hair cut every day. Like he was so vain, and his Brioni suits, or, you know, the silk ties, and you know, New York loved it. I mean, I was living in New York I was living in New York when a lot of that shit was happening. Like he fixed the jury, Teflon Don. He would throw these fireworks. I mean, if you're from Brooklyn, you know, there's parts of Brooklyn, Bensonhurst, but you know, Ozone Park is very similar in Queens, and you know, he was kind of folk hero in his neighborhood. But
question for you about John Gotti and Sammy the Bull, since you're very knowledgeable on this subject. Someone who is, let's say, a fan of Sammy would say, look, Sammy was loyal. He wanted to keep Omerta or whatever he thought that meant to him. But when John Gotti basically said, look, I'm the boss, I'm needed on the streets, I'm throwing you under the bus, and you're going to go to jail forever, and I'm going to go back free. And Sammy said, you know what? In his head, no, I'm going to cooperate because I'm not, I've been loyal to you forever, and you're throwing me under the bus. So I'm going to cooperate, and actually you're going to go to jail, and I'm, you know, going to do whatever. And of course, there are some people who follow this stuff that would say, no, John Gotti was like a true blue, you know, he had his flaws, but he was a true blue gangster. And he, you know, he never talked, he never cooperated, and et cetera, et cetera. When you look at the Sammy, John Gotti argument, and of course, different people have different sides, how do you kind of look at that? And who do you think was right, for lack of a better word, or do you don't really think anyone was right?
Well, I mean, yeah, Gotti was going to sell out his underboss. I mean, Sammy was a stone cold killer gangster, and I think he was a much more feared, and was much more skilled at business. Like he had all these businesses, you know, drywall and nightclubs, and Gotti was a, you know, thug. Like his main thing was hijacking, right? Yeah, but I mean, people don't realize there was a Joe Valachi back in the 50s. I mean, in the 50s, 60s. That was the first guy that really was a made guy that talked. But by the time Sammy, when he flipped, right before he flipped, the underboss of the Lucchese's, Little John Darko, agreed to cooperate. So it was kind of in the air, and now everybody cooperates, right? I think he made a strategic chess move. I think Sammy's more of a gangster to me than Gotti. I mean, I think Sammy probably saw, he's gonna fuck me over. So, of course he became that most hated guy, and he's he killed a lot of close friends. Like, that's a lot of times it was just greed. So the families, when he did this book Underboss with Peter Moss, a really great writer, they got sued for the son of Sam laws exist. Like, so all the victims' families, meaning the daughters and the wives of all these made guys, and sued him. Like, you can't profit from murdering my father. Stuff though. But look, there's not a lot of good guys in that life. I know a few. I mean, I can't name the names of guys I know, but I know some guys personally, and you wouldn't know who they are. Own restaurants, made captains, up in Arthur Avenue area, and Westchester. I know two made guys, Genovese guy and Bonanno. And the Genovese guy is thought by guys on the street to be the real boss of the family, because they have like the Genovese keep it real low on actually who's running shit. But like, you can't be a famous gangster. That's the problem with what Gotti did. Like, you cannot have your face on the cover of Time magazine. And the other thing he did that is a real asshole move. He demanded, he took over the Ravenite Social Club, remember, in Mulberry Street. And I remember going down there. He demanded that all the captains, 25 or whatever captain, 25 capos had to come to the Ravenite like one day a week to just pay homage to him and, whatever, kiss his ass, kiss his ring. And, like the FBI guys had told me, it was a beautiful thing. I mean, now we had every guy, like, they had surveillance going. Before, they had the bug in the apartment upstairs at the Ravenite that's really famous. And they were like, this was the stupidest fucking thing we ever saw anybody do. Now we got every single guy. We can see who they are. And Sam, they used to do walk and talks, So Gotti did a lot of stuff. If you're a mob guy, you got to be in the shadows. What
about Paul Castellano? Now, of course, the way I understand it is Paul Castellano told Gotti's crew, no drug sales. Gotti's crew was like, we're starving. We're going to do what we have to do. And then Castellano was possibly, or at least Gotti and his crew, they thought Castellano might take them out. So Gotti's like, we're just going to take him out, and we know the rest of the story.
Well, yeah, what that was the commission trial. So what happened is within Gotti's crew, you had like Angelo Ruggiero. Yeah, they were selling heroin. Look, mob guys going back to Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky were always involved in drugs. The idea that they were not involved in drugs is just a myth that people saw in The Godfather. The rule in the Mafia was don't get caught. So people knew, like Castellano knew, guys, but Ruggiero got caught, and there were tapes. So he kept saying to his very feared underboss, Neil Della Croce, he kept saying, I want those tapes. I want those tapes. Yeah, and he was it was a cardinal rule. I think Ruggiero was gonna get killed. So they had to whack him because Gotti was gonna get whacked. This is how that life is, man. Like, it's not and by the way, like Michael Francesi, he's in my Russian mob book about the they had this gasoline tax scam, which was billions, right? And it was the Russian Jews, Soviet-born Jews partnering with Italians. And he was making, he told me this like in my book, but he said it otherwise, 10 million cash a week. That was his cut. And he would kick up to to his boss, Junior Persico. There's a lot of envy in that life. So people started to spread rumors within the Colombo family that he wasn't kicking up the full amount that he should. He gets called to a meeting with his own father, Sonny Francis. He gets called to a meeting, and it was a very good chance, if he had like talked his way and proven it at the sit down, that he was going to get whacked with his own father walking him into it. Right. So yeah, I mean, that's a real, I'm just letting you know what I know personally. It really, one of the most accurate things was in Donnie Brasco, when they showed Lefty, who Al Pacino plays. It's like, it's in this life, you get called, you get sent for, and it's your best friend that's going to kill you, right? They really, you just got to understand this. Like, it really, the reason the Appalachian Conference was called is that guys started to buy their button, meaning, you know, they were earning a lot of money. But in the old days and the real rules, you had to do a hit. You had to kill somebody to get made. So you just, if you know, people romanticize the Italian mafia, every single guy you've heard of that's a made guy pulled the trigger and blew somebody's brains out. I mean, or strangled or whatever. Like this is a fraternity of serial killers, essentially. Like, I don't romanticize it. But getting back to your point about it's died down. I mean, read my if you're The Last Boss of Brighton, my book. The Russians, and this is real organized crime, they were whacking each other left and right. There were hundreds of attempted murders and murders in the 90s and 2000s. Boris Nayfeld, the mob guy I'm writing about, into the 2000s, he got called to do a contract killing and got, you know, caught by the FBI. So it happens. You just the Albanians are really strong. The Italians are not what the Italian five families are not what they used to be. Yeah. So that's part of it. And if you hear about a Russian, you know, a few Russian guys got killed, you're not going to say, oh, wow, that's organized crime, that's mafia, but it's the same thing, right? So if you go up to Arthur Avenue, I recommend anybody, you really want to see where the mob is in New York. There's Bensonhurst, but go up to Arthur Avenue. It's great restaurants and everything, but some of them are owned by Albanians. They have Albanian social clubs. So the Albanians are hungrier, you know, the generations who are more off the boat, basically. And Albania is the poorest country in Europe. So, I mean, the guys who are made guys now in the Italian mafia are third generation, whatever. They've been in America. Boris Nayfeld, it's a great scene in my book. I hate to keep plugging it, but he has a sit down. It's over a prostitution brothels, a bunch of massage parlors. But he gets called to this sit down with a wise guy, a made guy. The beef he's got, Boris has a beef with a guy named Sasha, another Russian. But the guy, Sasha, brings a made guy. I won't name him. And Boris comes to the meeting and he goes, you know, what do you want, war? You want a fucking war? Why are you getting involved in a Russian problem? Do you ever see Russians get involved? And I was like, why were you, you know, this is a made guy. Why are you ready to go to war? He goes, the Italians, look, man, they got kids in college. They got businesses. I'm straight from the Soviet Union. Like, the Russians really didn't give a fuck. And it's partly because they're just fresh off the boat. They were hungrier. So once you've got things to lose, like kids in college, and I mean, yeah, gangsters are the most dangerous guy in any situation. You know this, you're from Brooklyn. In any situation, I don't care if it's a street fight, jail, is the guy who has nothing to lose, meaning the most scary guy in prison isn't a mob guy, it's some 17-year-old blood or crip or whatever who, you know, never knew his parent. It just doesn't give a fuck. Nobody ever said, I love you to this kid. He's a scary guy because he doesn't care. You know?
Yeah, I agree with that. I remember when I was growing up in New York City, and there was a point in the 80s when New York was incredibly dangerous and the subways were incredibly dangerous. Meanwhile, I was taking the subways every day. And I remember sometimes you look at someone sitting across from you and you're like, this guy just got out of Rikers Island. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care about himself. He doesn't care if he goes back. This is not a guy you want to interact with. So I'm with you.
Oh my God. My first book I wrote, it takes place in Crown Heights, the Franklin Avenue Posse. And I knew guys did 3 bids. They were coming out of prison, and there was this guy, Michael Duffy. Oh my God. I mean, feared fist fighter, used to beat up Mike Tyson because he's like 3 years older than Tyson. Just a very feared guy with his fists, but just in and out of prison. And I remember I lifted weights with him one time, and the guy was just a scary fuck, right? But if he's watching this, I don't know. I hope Michael Duffy's still alive. But
well, I just want to say, for those who don't know, because obviously I'm from Brooklyn, because you mentioned Crown Heights and Mike Tyson. So in Brooklyn, you have East New York, then you have next to Brownsville, and next to that Crown Heights. So Crown Heights and Brownsville touch each other.
Yeah, they're close. Yeah. But Crown Heights is more Jamaican and Caribbean. And Mike Tyson, in this book, Fire and Fear by Jose Torres, Mike Tyson says, because people think, oh, Tyson's from the rough, Brownsville, never ran, never will. They have all these slogans. Tyson says, oh, the real gangsters, the scariest guys were in Crown Heights. Because there were these...
Just pause for a second. I want to say something interesting. I don't doubt that, because obviously Mike Tyson knows more than I do about that. And he's a year older than me. And, but it's just funny how I grew up in a slightly different part of Brooklyn, not far away. But as a kid, we were taught Crown Heights was dangerous, but it was doable. You could survive, you know.
Yeah.
But
no, that's true. That's very true.
we were told that Brownsville and East New York, you're just dead. I mean, you just don't even go there ever.
Well, in my first book, so my first book is called Street Kingdom, and I was cool hanging out in, they thought I was Puerto Rican sometimes, right? So I was cool hanging out there. But yeah, one of my friends moved to East New York. That's a dangerous, depressing, it's a lot scarier in East New York than Crown Heights. Crown Heights, especially now, it's become gentrified, and you also have the headquarters of the Lubavitch movement right there on Kingston, right? So it's more diverse. But what Tyson was talking about wasn't like street fear and muggings. He was just talking about there were more stone killers from Flatbush, East Flatbush and Crown Heights. And these were guys who were straight from Kingston, Jamaica, where life is cheap and they'd grown up like, you know, where Bob Marley's from. And it's just a, you know, nobody's tough. But anyway, I'm getting back to this guy, Mike Duffy. Duffy wasn't a Caribbean guy. And I'm really lucky he didn't rob me at the West Indian Day Parade. He was trying to juke me. He was trying to stick me up. And my friends were like, Duffy, don't, you know, he's with us. Duffy kept going back to prison. And I was like, I remember asking, why? And it's like he could function better in prison. He could beat the shit out of guys in prison. He knew where he really couldn't. This is called being institutionalized, right? So this is a scary thing that you're talking about. There's guys who, when they're out in the world, they don't know how to go get a job. They, you know, their prison record prevents them from getting good jobs. They don't want to be janitors and shit, right? So they function better in institutions. And sometimes I have seen this with my own eyes. Guys will do a crime just to go back because they'll run the tier, you know, C-74 or whatever. They're not going to get raped. Nothing's going to happen. They're going to in fact say, give me those sneakers and shit. They'll run things in a way that they can't on the street. That's a scary thing to be around. Guys who really kind of want to go back to that place. So anyway, I don't romanticize crime. And a lot of these guys are just, most criminals that I've gotten to know, and there's some interesting, charming ones like gangsters, they never got the delayed gratification gene. They don't understand. They want something that most of us realize we have to spend 8 to 10 months or 2 years, or they want it. Fucking, I want that car now, you know, whatever that's usually their downfall, right? Narcissism and hubris.
Tell me what you think of this. I grew up around, you know, plenty of Mafia guys, and I grew up around.
What was your neighborhood? You said nearby. Which one?
I grew up across the street from the Brooklyn Bridge.
So Williamsburg, or
no? It's on the border of Brooklyn Heights and Dumbo, which, by the way,
Dumbo, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Brooklyn Heights and Dumbo are two of the most expensive neighborhoods in the United States now. When I was a kid, if you walked in Dumbo, you got shot, and that was a 2-minute walk from my house.
Yeah.
And Brooklyn Heights was crime-ridden. But anyway, with that said, I want to ask you about this, what I've noticed. I don't know if this is part of the culture or what, but imagine this, Douglas, imagine this. Doug, imagine this. Let's just say someone grew up in a very wild environment, maybe doing crime, in and out of jail, but somehow things work out for them. They're out of jail, they make some money, things got stabilized. You would think a lot of those people would say, oh, good, everything's kind of worked out. Maybe someone's looking over me. I'm going to kind of calm down now. Mm-hmm. I know so many guys from that life. Then they rob a bank. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, they're addicted
to the adrenaline rush sometimes, you know, like it's just, this Russian mobster I just wrote about, I just did a book with Ice-T and his friend Spike. And it was about, they used to do Ice-T, before he was a rapper, jewelry licks. They used to go, you know, smash and grabs and take down 30 Rolexes or, $300,000. This is in South Central Los Angeles, but they would travel all over. And it's an addiction. Like once that power to just go take something from other people, you would think they're set for life. You know, you got $20 million, you know, but they just can't retire.
That's right. So that's when they do. Hey, by the way, just want to go back to Paul Castellano for 1 second. I know we got into some interesting.
And by the way, I'm not an expert on the Gambinos at all, but like I just happen to. I know the stories. That's not firsthand shit that I know, but yeah, I know the stories of what happened.
What's your opinion of this? I want to get back to the Brooklyn stuff in a moment. You know, Crown Heights and stuff, but one of the excuses, if we can use the word excuses, I don't know if that's the right word, or rationales for killing Paul Castellano. In addition to what we said about, you know, Gotti's crew selling drugs and everything, is a lot of people said he was very greedy, meaning he was making a ton of freaking money and he wasn't sharing it well. Do you think that possibly if he was more generous with his underlings, they wouldn't have taken him out? Or you think that's just some incidental thing they just threw in?
No. I mean, all I know is, I've read Sammy's stories. They would go to the big White House, his Todd Hill, which is in Staten Island. Like, that's where this Boris Nayfeld. There's parts of Staten Island, for people who don't know New York, that are just, it's cops, firefighters, mob. Like, there's just sections right there. It's the most, except for Bensonhurst. There's areas as well, but you go to where Castellano lives, it's just, you're surrounded by mob guys. Yeah, he didn't share it. He was greedy. I think the smart bosses, like his predecessor, Carlo Gambino. So he's the son-in-law of Carlo Gambino. That's why he was kind of made. He also wasn't, as Sammy would say, he was a racketeer and not a gangster. He wasn't a street guy. So he was really into legit businesses. And he had, he was one of the biggest meat companies, beef. So he was trying to be a white collar boss. And in a family as big as the Gambinos, you've got crews that do that. You've got crews that are just in the garbage industry. They're running businesses, but then you have like stick-up men and gangsters, right? And so guys like Francesi and Sammy will always talk. They're the two most prominent on YouTube. Difference between a racketeer and a gangster. And some guys are both, but they started to look at Paul Castellano as a racketeer who was putting money. He also sided at one point with the Genovese family in a beef. I remember Sammy saying, like, there was some issue, and he was like, because he was very close with Chin. They made a lot of money together. So there are a lot of reasons. Yeah, I think Castellano didn't. Nobody deserves to die, but yeah, he didn't have the loyalty. He didn't instill the fear. Maybe like Chin was a fucking scary guy. Let me explain this. People don't understand. Chin made a rule. This is in my mob book about the garbage industry. He was the most powerful boss. Fuck what you heard about Gotti. Gotti got more headlines. Chin was powerful. The Genovese family was bigger in terms of manpower, more made guys. Chin made a rule that you could not say his name. He was so careful. He was never caught on a wiretap. He never talked on phones. He played crazy for so long. FBI agents came to his apartment in Greenwich Village, and like he was literally standing with an umbrella in the shower, like just playing crazy. He was not crazy, but he did that for years. But there was a rule, so you would see guys going, like in a meeting, they would just, you could not say Chin. And what was the penalty? Killing offense, right? So there's a scene in this, and this is like recorded. This guy in the garbage industry starts talking and saying, he said, Chin, like, because everything was being kicked up to Chin, right? And because he said it, he was like, don't fucking say that name. The other guy said, don't say that fucking name. You trying to get us whacked? That's how serious it was. So anyway, I think that's really fascinating. That's a guy that really ran his family, and people were so afraid of him. I'm talking the maid guys and the captains could not say even his nickname. They would do this. Wow, that's a gangster. Like, that's a scary fucking gangster. But he must have been respected. You'd never hear about how the Genovese family was going to rebel against Chin or anything like that. So I don't like Castellano. All these guys. It's a dicey thing. You're dealing with street characters. Like Gotti's crew were scary street guys who were, because of the proximity to the airport, right? JFK. If you've seen Goodfellas, they talk about all the heists. So the guys, the Lucchese's were there. The Gotti crew, which was out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club, right? They were close to what used to be called Idlewild, whatever the first name was. And then so it's just a simple proximity thing. They would do a lot of these stick-ups, take down container ships of fur coats or cigarettes or whatever. So that's the street level, and that's a lot different from running a pump and dump thing on Wall Street or medical fraud, which, like, the Russian mob guys, my God, they're still barely active by the Russians, in all sorts of like medical fraud and insurance fraud, all sorts of shit that you got to be a little more savvy with business. And most of the Russian mob guys had college degrees. A lot of them came from the Soviet Union with university educations. So they would, they'd get doctors to play ball. Like, you're a chiropractor. you know, it can be quite lucrative to scam insurance companies. But that is a different skill set than putting a gun to a truck driver and saying, give me your driver's license. We know who you are. Get out of it. You know, we're taking your truck. Those scenes that you saw in Goodfellas were true, right? Like Jimmy the Gent, is, you know, the De Niro played Jimmy Burke. Man, he was a scary motherfucker. Right?
Let me ask you this about the psychology, or at least your thoughts on the psychology. So take a guy like Sammy the Bull. Do you think a guy like Sammy the Bull was born? I know we're only speculating. Where genetically he's not psychotic at all. He's just a kid, but then his environment is what it is, and he is in the Rampers Street Gang, and then he's, you know, he's in the Colombos, and then he moves to the Gambinos. And then at some point when he's involved in what he's involved in, he's just so numb to just killing and all this stuff that he just becomes that way. Or do you think he has like this psychotic gene, sociopathic gene, where he's just a bit of a sociopath, so he just doesn't feel what most feel when they're involved in doing what he's doing? You think it's like a sociopathic thing, or do you think
no, I mean, Sammy whacked guys and had no remorse. Boris Mayfield, who I just wrote about, he'd never been convicted of murder, but the Russian, you know, if you've seen Russian, they're called Vorzakoni. If you are, it's a thief in law, it's like a maid guy. If you're covered in tattoos, it's like a story where you did your time, and he's got 4 skulls. So I know there's 4 bodies that and you can't lie on you'll get killed if you put something that's not true to the, so he has no remorse for it. Like, I mean, zero. He doesn't think.
You think that's a sociopathic tendency?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like, I mean, it's hard, you know, we're surrounded. People have seen too many serial killer movies about like Ted Bundy. Wall Street is filled with now it's called antisocial personality disorder. It used to be called psychopathy, whatever. But like, my mother's a psychologist, and when I first heard about, you know, psychopaths, and I thought they were like all killers, right? And my mother said to me, Doug, don't you understand, like, antisocial personality disorder, Wall Street is filled with it. Bernie Madoff, these guys are, no, they did what they did, and they do not care about anybody and anything to justify. So when you think about it, you've probably interacted with a lot of your viewers and listeners who have probably interacted with sociopaths or antisocial personality disorder. There's a lot of interesting characteristics that I think, you know, abandonment in childhood. There's all sorts of things that I think are contributing factors, but I also think there's genetics. I really think some people are predisposed to this. Right. But it's not as simple as, you know, oh yeah, the kid that grew up burning the cat alive and then did this and then graduated to like stalking women and killing them. Some of these sociopaths are just, you know, they're just pump and dump rip-off artists as well. Like, you don't have to be a killer, right?
I'm saying it for years to people. I agree. You took the words right out of my mouth. Hey, just back to the Russian mob for a second. How does the Russian, and by the way, the Russian mob, of course, is in, you know, a big part of it in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, which is right near, you know, it's very close to Bensonhurst and Bay Ridge and Beach, very Italian area.
They partnered together a lot, so they worked together hand in hand in a couple of really big scams. But yeah,
I was just one thing about the Russian mob. I was going to ask: is there some unsaid things where the Russians are like, look, you guys know we handle this kind of stuff, and we know you handle that kind of stuff. Don't get involved in our stuff. We won't get involved in your.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah, like the Russians have much more. They're much more involved in, you know, let's call it, you know, human trafficking. Like, I mean, but there are incredibly like high-priced call girls all over Beverly Hills and everything. And the Russians, you know, bring these girls from Latvia and Belarus and all these places. So yeah, Italians won't get involved in that. They won't fuck with it. But
because they're too moral to do it, or they're afraid of the Russians?
No, it's just territorial. Like Boris, who I just wrote about, he was a massive heroin importer. So he'd bring the stuff, China white heroin back in the 80s and 90s from Thailand straight into, he got it into Warsaw, Poland, and then into New York. But then he had to lay it off. Well, some Russians would sell it, but his main buyers were Sicilians, you know, Zips, they would call them, right? So they're, you know, generally they don't beef and there's territorial, but like, yeah, the Russians have a lot of rackets that the Italians don't mess with. When I asked Boris why, so this massive, well, I won't get into the details. You can read my book or listen to Francesi talk about it. The gasoline tax scam was probably the biggest thing. Francesi says to me in the book, Doug, gasoline was the biggest thing since Prohibition, much bigger than drugs. It was like hundreds of millions of dollars. So just Francesi's operation, one small part of it was 100 million, you know, or 10 million a week. Tim, I asked Boris, why did you like? So Boris's crew was a guy named Murat Balagula, a Jewish guy from. Sorry, we're Jews, so we can say a Jew, but it's more. It's what I don't like when people say it. I like to hear a Jewish person. So anyway, Murat Balagula is a Jewish guy from Odessa, and he partnered with the Lucchese's. And I said to Boris, well, why did you guys partner up 50-50 with the Italians on the gasoline? And he goes, we could have tried to do it, but the Italians were established. They had their guys on the waterfront. They had their friends in the police department. You know, the Italians were, Russians literally had just come, you know, in 79, 80. Some of them had been there. A lot of these guys didn't even speak English. So in it, you know, especially when you're talking about scams that involve the waterfront, the mob, the Italian mob had the unions. You never hear about the Russians getting involved in like the longshoremen's union, et cetera, et cetera. So like Boris said to me, like they've been there since, you know, the era of Lucky Luciano. They had worked into, you know, the Godfather is not unrealistic when they talk about, you know, the Don having all the politicians and all the unions in his pocket. So the Russians didn't have that. But the Russians had their own racket. So yeah, most of the prostitution in Israel, I've been, you know, it's quite tragic, but the Russians are the source of a lot. I think they're not like, I hate to say it, like your stereotype of a prostitute. These are 21-year-old gorgeous women that a lot of times their families encourage them to go as a model or something. And Boris was involved in it. Like he knew that they smuggled them into Mexico. Because it's easier, take away their passport. They are smuggled in the trunk of a car, usually into LA. And I mean, there's a whole price point, but then, you know, and then they go to work. So I mean, to a lot of people now, especially after Me Too. And I mean, that's a really disgusting thing, but you know, prostitution has always been a huge part of American society. It's there.
When you mentioned about their parents encouraging them in Thailand, at least for a time, there are some very poor families in Thailand from more rural parts of Thailand, and they just encourage their son to do Thai boxing to make some money, and they encourage their daughter to be a prostitute.
Yep.
Now, obviously, it's not all families there, but however, that does happen. Let me ask you about Franklin Avenue again. Remember we were talking before about some of the mafia guys who kind of get things together and you're like, hey, you have 20 million in the bank, you're not in jail, just chill out. But they're like, now it's time to rob a bank. When it comes to the Franklin Avenue, you know, Crown Heights, Brownsville, East Flatbush, do you find that, you know, even if they grew up in they never met their dad, possibly, they were poverty stricken, they were surrounded by crime, they're in and out of jail. Do you find that if for some reason, all of a sudden they're 25 years old and things kind of do work out, maybe they do chill out a little bit and they just move to upstate New York? Or are they like some of the mafia guys who are like, no, now we're going to rob a bank?
I know two guys. I don't want to put their names out there, but they're in my book. And one did a bid, you know, goes upstate for manslaughter. The other, they're three brothers, right? Oh my God. They all had, you know, either murder convictions. And the youngest one, who's still my really good friend, he had, it was interstate gun smuggling, 5 years in the federal. You know what? Both those guys got out of crime. I mean, they spent their whole youth into their 20s in crime. The oldest, who had the manslaughter bid, he got into the construction union. It's interesting how guys with prison records, you have to kind of, they have these it's called African-American coalitions, and they'll show up because it's usually like, you know, Italians really ran the construction and they would be all, you know, Italian guys. So they would, you know, come down there and have like almost a street confrontation. You hire a couple of our guys, you know, black guys, and then eventually get into the union. Anyway, he became a foreman, and he's like, I think, he was was crazy, making 50 an hour, $50 an hour, something like that, doing real well. He lives in Atlanta now, and he's a legit guy. You would never know meeting him. He's married. His Facebook posts are all like he's on a cruise with his wife. Life is great. And this is a guy who was a convicted murderer.
So let's explore this a little bit, because I asked you the question and you answered it in a way that I'm already kind of familiar with these topics, meaning back to kind of the Italian mafia guys that I've been familiar with. Like I said, live a crazy life, but somehow they're out of jail. They have a lot of money, but they're happy to rob a bank. But some of the guys from Crown Heights and Brownsville have a crazy upbringing, in and out of jail. They make money and they're like, oh, I'm going to move to Atlanta and have a normal life. So I've already observed that. And then you answered it that way. What do you think the Italian mafia mindset is versus the, Crown Heights, Brownsville mindset that makes the mafia guys just be like, no, we're just living in the moment. I don't care. I have 20 million. Let's go rob a bank.
Well, part of it is that there's much more structure in the mafia. There really is a structure, right? So, I mean, if you're talking about made guys, and I know a few, they'll have legit businesses, but they are sort of sworn to criminality, right? The guys I knew from Crown Heights, they were pretty powerful, like drug dealers, right? So it'd be a drug crew. But I mean, this is as common a story, right? You'll see a guy who looks broke. He's got like no teeth and he's in a wheelchair. And someone will tell you, he had 3 Porsches. He's 52 years old. And he's like, he's smoking Newports in a wheelchair because he got shot. I mean, 50 Cent is not the only guy that got shot like 9 times, right? There's a bunch of guys I know that survived gunshot wounds. But like these guys, it's really common to know a guy who has nothing, or you'll see photos of them when they were 18, 19. This was in the crack era when you were talking about how dangerous New York was. Well, one of the reasons was crack just exploded, right? In 83, 84, 85, 86. These guys were 18-year-old millionaires, right? Didn't know what to do with their money. Had so much money that sometimes you hear stories like there was so much cash, the rats started to eat the cash, right? Like couldn't spend the money. But once they get arrested, everything is gone. And it's a younger crew out there on the street. So are you going to muscle your way back into being a drug dealer again? Whereas I know Italian guys, once they come out, they may have done 20 years, they come back, things are still set up for them to continue. That's part of it. And also, like, I think we talk about toxic masculinity, right? Andrew Tate. I think when we're young, I don't know what you were into, but like I did a lot of dumb shit when I was 18, 19. And I was a middle-class Jewish guy in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And I still did stuff that was illegal, like breaking and entering into the school to steal tests. I mean, stupid shit, right? So imagine if you're coming up in East Flatbush or Crown Heights or whatever, and everybody's got a gun. And I mean, so your mindset when you're 18 and 19 versus 40, 50, like, I don't know, you have a lot more sense of, do you really want to go back to when you're 40 or 50 and you've been in prison a long time? And I know guys that have. It must get stale. Like if they're not institutionalized, like that guy I mentioned, Duffy.
Somehow the mafia guys don't mind. You said it best. I forgot the exact quote, but I think the mafia guys are sworn to organized crime, and the guys in Crown Heights and Brownsville are sworn to survival.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You're right. And so, but like Boris, this Russian mob guy, he says he's back in Moscow. He's 74. Been to prison 3 times in the States, been to the gulag before that, in Soviet times. And he says to me, Doug, guys like me we don't never retire. Like, it's not like I retired from this life. So I said, don't tell me this over WhatsApp. And he says something like, no, right now I just give advice to younger criminals. I'm like an elder statesman. So I don't want to know what he's really into. If it's like, because the thing is, shit that is illegal in the United States, protection rackets, it's the norm in Russia. Like the word in Russian is krisha. I'm going to give you some real game, your listeners. The word in Russian is krisha, which is a roof. It just means a protection racket. You have to pay 20 or 30% to organized crime. That was their bread and butter in the Diamond District of New York. But so in Russia now, every business pays krisha. And that now, instead of organized crime, it goes all the way up to the top to Putin. That's why Putin is probably the richest. I have an article, if anybody wants to Google it, I wrote an article saying Putin is the most powerful mobster of all time. I just meant he is he acts like a mobster. He uses mob language, but also Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are not the richest man on earth, but Putin is the richest man on earth. And it's because the entire society in Russia has to pay protection. So there's things that a guy like Boris would get arrested for in the United States that actually are the way I hate to say it, but Russia's kind of a criminal society. It is a criminal, there's a criminal organization. And a lot of these oligarchs actually are kind of oligarch gangsters.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, yeah, there's guys, I'm getting a bit off topic, but there's guys that just don't retire. They don't know another way, right? I asked Boris, why didn't you like go straight? He goes, I became a criminal at such a young age. Like he was a street thug, you know, a hooligan, they called it. Hooligan in Russian. Knifing guys, you know, just, he said, I became a criminal so young. I don't think I can change anymore. So there's that mindset too. But I think you're right. Some guys just did it to survive, to hustle, you know, and maybe they found a legit hustle. Like Ice-T was a stone career criminal. And when he got into rap, he said, I didn't stop being, I just applied what I was doing as a thief, a jewel thief and a criminal. I just applied that now to music. And now he looks at, like, he'll say, you know, he was like a pimp for a while, right? So he'll say, pimping and hoeing is as old as civilization. And now he's on Law and Order, right? He goes, Dick Wolf, the creator of Law and Order, the whole franchise, he goes, Dick Wolf is my pimp. I'm the, you know, but he's a good pimp. He pays me well. So it's like some guys are able to come from the street and go, I didn't switch my way of thinking about the world. I just made my hustle legit, you know, and Jay-Z has said that. A lot of these guys who became rap, you know, I mean, 50 Cent, Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, I think they're all billionaires or close. I think Jay-Z's definitely a billionaire. And people will say all they did was take that drug dealing mentality. It's the same, and start using it towards entertainment. You know, it's not saying they're doing illegal stuff, but they just switched up their hustle to a legal hustle now, right?
Yeah.
Like, anyway.
You said, you know, about when people are a certain age, they may not want to go to jail, but a lot of the Italian mafia guys, they don't seem to mind. And there's the great scene in Casino, of course, when Joe Pesci, which is based on it's very accurate depiction of a real guy from Chicago who moved out to Vegas, I believe.
Yeah.
But anyway,
That's the ant, Tony the Ant. Yeah, he was a 5'2" guy or whatever, but he was like a stone killer, very scary guy.
He's threatening that banker, and he said, you know, if you don't give me my money back, I'm going to break your skull. And he's like, but I don't care about jail. That's my business. You know, my jail is my business. So anyway,
well, I was just real quick. I'll tell you. So Boris, you know, he could give a fuck. He doesn't want to go into prison. I mean, he doesn't want to again, but partly because it's a bit of a myth, but it still exists. MCC, which is the federal lockup. I mean, you're a New Yorker. I mean, that's where El Chapo, all these guys were. But like Boris said, you know, the Italians, they really do. The Italians and the Russians hang out together. They are like, because they're white and organized crime is very similar. And Boris said, yeah, it was great. MCC was great. We'd, you know, Italians would always make pasta. We'd eat their spaghetti and we talk about stuff. And then when he went to do time in Colorado, oh my God, it's a hilarious line in my book. It was money laundering and racketeering, but he gets sent to this prison, FCI Inglewood. And he's like, oh my God, we had like yoga. I learned, we said, it was like, we'd have bocce ball and, you know, we'd have these tournaments. I won all the chess tournaments. It was like, well, also Russians did time, and Russian prisons are still this way, by the way. It's just filthy. And if you become one of the untouchables called opasheni, like a petuch, a rooster is a guy who's been raped. You literally must sleep near the toilet. And so if you've done time in a Russian prison, no American prison scares them. They actually think you know, they're the guys that coined, these are like country clubs. Like they really, what great food. Like you barely got enough calories in the Soviet gulags. You barely got enough calories to survive. Like Boris can tell me. So anyway, it all depends on what you've done with your life. If you've done hard time, so American prisons to some of these guys are not scary. Yeah. And if the Italians actually, what they did in a really good scene is Henry Hill, you know, remember that with you know, they're slicing up the garlic, and
Good
but
thought.
they really are Italian sections. It's not like they're the scariest guys in prison, but they have bribed the guards, they get stuff smuggled in, and they have their little clique, you know, so they're I guess they're comfortable. I don't know. I mean, nobody wants to do their entire life in prison, but like they used to say, I could do that standing on my head, you know, 5 years, 7 years. That's why, getting back to one of your points about why was drug dealing, why was it a killing offense? Like, why did Castellano need these? It's because the rule about getting caught was that you're not getting a 5 to 7 year sentence for heroin. You're getting 100 years. You know, El Chapo has 400 years. He's dying in Colorado, right? Once you get 100-year sentence, everybody's gonna talk. Almost everybody's gonna talk. So in the old days, when the mob guys got busted for, you know, gambling or whatever, it would be a 5 years, you know, come home. But if you know you're going to die in prison, so that was the prescription against the prohibition within the mob about getting caught with drugs, was just because the time is so long that almost everybody starts cooperating.
Which is like the RICO Act did the Mafia in. I think Giuliani had a part of that. I think the RICO Act actually existed for a long time. They just started applying it in the 90s.
Yeah, and Giuliani started to use it as the assistant prosecutor in the commission case. As, I mean, you never got a boss. You never could get a boss ordering a hit, because it would be delegated right down the line. But if you could show a criminal enterprise, and it, like, this is all a structured. And Boris, like my guy, he's my friend. Actually, kind of, he got busted with racketeering, and the Soviets, like, they couldn't understand that. I didn't touch the drugs. But they didn't understand the conspiracy laws of the United States, which really, yeah, I mean, you just have to be aware or be part of the structure, and you could get charged with the murder, right? So, yeah, I mean, you could never get Frank Costello or Lucky Luciano on a murder charge, or Meyer Lansky or Bugsy Siegel. These guys murdered a lot of people, but they didn't get near. I mean, not to say Bugsy Siegel definitely, like, did some hits personally, but it was very rare that you could get a mob boss on murder. I mean, just anyway, that's off. We didn't even get to boxing, so we'll have to do another episode.
No, actually, I was about to say, let's switch gears a little bit to Barney Ross and boxing. And for those who don't know, you know, Barney Ross was one of the greatest boxers in modern history. He happened to be a Jewish boxer. And a lot of people also don't know, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, there were a lot of great Jewish boxers a lot of them were champions, because there was so much anti-Semitism in the US then that it was just hard to get jobs and do business. And, you know, the Jewish people did the best they could, or become middlemen, or, you know, different things like that. But a lot of them, especially like you alluded to before, first generation out of Russia or Eastern Europe or wherever, a lot of them became boxers. And actually, there have been some spectacular Jewish boxing champs. And then as time went on, the 60s, 70s, 80s, and on, you know, Jewish people could make money doing other stuff. So for the most part, they got out of boxing, at least as far as being in the ring. But Barney Ross was spectacular, and you wrote a great book about him, which I read cover to cover. Loved it.
Thank you.
One, because you're a great writer, and two, because it's quite an interesting story. Just talk a little bit about Barney Ross, writing the book, researching the book. What were you surprised about? What were you impressed with? What made you want to write it about him in particular? Anything you want to say about that era of boxing?
Well, first, yeah, people don't believe it, because it was in the 20s and 30s that there were like 2,000 or 3,000 professional Jewish fighters. So many world champions, usually featherweight, like Abe Attell. I could name them all.
Abe Attell, superstar.
Yeah, these are some of the greatest boxers of all time, and people don't believe it really happened. But most of these guys, if you grew up on the Lower East Side of New York, or as Barney Ross did, the Jewish ghetto of Chicago was Maxwell Street, you had an Italian neighborhood right there, an Irish neighborhood. And yes, it was like, if the Jews wanted to go to the swimming pool, they had to go through the Irish neighborhood, and they'd have to fight. So you had to fight. You had to use your fists. So a guy like Barney Ross, his father got murdered in a holdup. He's in the streets. You know, he came from an Orthodox Jewish family, but suddenly he's in the streets. He's fighting a lot. There were boxing clubs everywhere in America. Like, I got an old school shirt, right? Liston versus when it was really still Cassius Clay. boxing was a huge sport in the United States, Canada. What in the 1920s and 30s, the three major sports, because there was no NBA, there was no NFL. The most popular sports were baseball, like, you know, the era of Babe Ruth, horse racing, and boxing. Boxing was huge. It's not anymore. I mean, it's so down the ladder. And I mean, I'm old enough even to remember, I'm sure you do, watching a fight with Howard Cosell and Muhammad Ali for free on ABC or whatever, Wide World of Sports.
ABC Sports.
Now you got to spend $50 or $99 to watch Pacquiao versus Mayweather, and it's like sometimes it's a boring fight. So anyway, boxing that's why MMA has stepped in, and that's it. But anyway, Barney was a great. So he was in the streets, but then he goes to this gym. That's a great story I just told at a synagogue, giving a talk about him. Thinks he can fight, and there's an old school trainer. The old school trainers knew shit that, I'm sorry, like a lot of this is a lost art. So he's got a cigar because, you know, they used to smoke cigars a lot in the boxing gyms. So Barney puts on the, you know, they wrap his hands, he puts on the gloves, he says, "Kid, you think you can fight?" And Dave Shade, the trainer, puts his hands behind his back, says, "Knock the cigar out of my mouth." And just using footwork, Barney was whiffing, and then it took Barney like 2 weeks, and he came back and he said, tries again. He goes, "I figured it out. You have to hit where the guy is going to be, not where he is." Right. So, you know, boxing is an art if you really understand what you're doing, and you do, of course, but like, it's a sweet science. So he learned it. He wasn't a knockout guy. He was a master boxer. Jewish fans like to see, they didn't want to see a slugger. So a slugger would be a guy like Rocky Marciano or
Jake LaMotta.
or Rocky Graziano. That was a famous, like the Italian community loved that. "I'll take 3 punches to land one." Jews never wanted to see that. They wanted to see a guy outbox you. So the Jewish style was much more what you'd see in Ali, and I'm not the slugfest like Thriller in Manila, but like, you know, outboxing a guy, dancing, master footwork, matador. So yeah, Ross ends up being lightweight champion of the world, and then he has this trilogy of fights with Jimmy McLaren.
Well, let me just chime in and say that for those who don't know, and I'm quite familiar with boxing history, Jimmy McLaren, that guy was really, really, really good. The
Hall of Famer. Yeah, all-time Hall of Famer.
The fact that Barney Ross did what he did with him is amazing. That guy is one of the best boxers ever.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, it was the 30s. You know, Hitler was on the rise. So in 1934, they meet for the first time. They fought 3 times. It was really great trilogies of all time. And it's just sad that it's forgotten. Barney's the lightweight champion, and that's 133 pounds. And he's going up to fight the welterweight champion, 147, right? That doesn't sound like a lot of difference.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot.
But never in history had the lightweight champion beaten the welterweight champion. And what's crazy is Jimmy McLaren didn't have an anti-Semitic bone in his body. Wonderful guy, was born in Northern Ireland, but actually was in Vancouver, British Columbia. Sweetest guy, nice guy. But he had beat 6 or 7 Jewish, can't remember the exact number, fighters in a row, including the great Benny Leonard, who came out of retirement.
Right.
Yeah, anyway, so they started to call him people say the Jew killer. That wasn't accurate. The press started to call him the Jew beater. And so they made it like, okay, this Irishman wearing the, you know, I showed this fight film, because I just go on YouTube. You can find these films now. It's amazing. You don't have to go like searching them. You can just enter Barney Ross, Jimmy McLaren, and 60,000 people are in it was called the Madison Square Garden Bowl. There was an outdoor bowl. Yep. And it was crazy. Like the owners of all the baseball teams, the Marx brothers, everybody's at this fight. And Barney comes out to the tunes of My Yiddish Mama, which was his fight song. Jimmy comes out with the heart, you know, of the Irish nation, green robe. The promoters used to do this back then. Like the Italians, they'd come out to a tarantella. So it's kind of fun when you look back on it. They made it like the Irishman versus the Jew, but really wasn't. Very rarely did they have animosity, because these guys in that generation were real sportsmen. I mean, they'd fight in the ring, but then they'd hug, and, you know, they supported each other outside the ring. Very rarely was there animosity. But anyway, so
look at that era, and you see when they took the still photos before the fights, they have their wraps on, but not the gloves yet, like Jack Dempsey, his era.
Yeah.
And you see them shaking hands, and really with this cordial handshake right before they were going to put the gloves on and fight.
Yeah. Yeah, there was none of this bullshit like stare downs where you're McGregor, you know, you're talking shit, or, you know, the kind of stuff you saw, like even Tyson, who's now turned into a very interesting, introspective guy. But remember seeing him screaming at a reporter at one point. I don't know if he's on cocaine then, but he was like screaming, you know, that a fat, he was calling him a faggot. So I hate to say these words, but then he was saying, I'll fuck you till you love me, bitch. I was like, what kind of person says that? Like that prison talk, right? No, they never did this stuff. They were, even Joe Louis was like the greatest heavyweight to guys of my dad's generation, up until Ali. But like, I mean, he had to be respectful. I mean, there was just this culture of how sportsmen acted. But anyway, Barney, 3 great fights. Barney wins the first, McClellan wins the second. They all went the distance. Neither guy knocked the other guy out. Then Barney wins the third and sort of takes ownership of, as the greatest fighter, the greatest lighter weight fighter. Then he comes up against a guy named Henry Armstrong.
Amazing fight. Legend.
And Armstrong outdid what Ross did, which was he came up from 122. And he just, I mean, if you want to, Joe Frazier didn't invent that swarming perpetual motion. They used to call Armstrong perpetual motion. Just go look at his fights. He would come and pressure fight you, right? So Barney fought him at that point. He was drinking and smoking cigarettes. He wasn't training like he should have been. So at the end of his career, 38, and the first 4 rounds, people say it was a massacre. And Barney didn't get knocked out, but he got beaten so bad by Henry Armstrong. But if you watch the first 4 rounds, Barney's outboxing him. He just lost his legs. There's a point in the 4th round where so a master boxer can beat a slugger. That's you see Ali can beat a swarming guy like Frazier. It's a very good matchup. It's a very interesting matchup. But anyway, and then after that, Barney has this whole other career that's fascinating. He joins the U.S. Marines, and it's World War II, 41. He enlists, and the Marines are real happy to have a world champion boxer. And they say, at Camp Pendleton in San Diego, just stay here and train, hand to hand. You've got a world champion fighter in the Marines. Like guys like Joe Louis, they didn't go to war. They actually just toured to keep the morale. You were in the service. Barney says, no, I want to see action. So he's in the 2nd Marines, very legendary Marine battle at Guadalcanal. Barney's there. He is horribly wounded, but he saves 22 guys. Just this incredible story that I encourage you to just read the book or look it up. And should have got the Congressional Medal of Honor, but it was very hard for Jews to get it back then. But he did get the Silver Star, comes back to the States, this massive hero. And but unfortunately, he was so badly wounded with shrapnel and got malaria that they used to allow imagine what little they knew about drugs. They used to allow the men to just inject their own morphine. So he got hooked and he came back, and he was still a famous war hero, touring the country to raise morale for war bonds. But now you can see the glassy, some of the photos, his eyes are glassy, and he became, doctors used to give him, friendly doctors would give him the morphine, but eventually he just started to get heroin. And he was one of the first guys to be a well-known junkie, meaning he, at that time, imagine celebrities now, Robert Downey Jr., there's so many celebrities that have come out with drug problems. But back then, Barney Ross had to go down and be arrested, because not for selling heroin, for using it, and then go to what they call the public health hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which wasn't a hospital. It was basically like his brother said to me, that was no hospital, it was a fucking jail. And he had to beat it cold turkey. And then he went to Congress. Like, it's amazing some of the stuff Barney did. He went to Congress when they started to have hearings in the 50s about drugs, the drug addiction problem. Barney goes there and says, we should not be treating the addicts as criminals. We need to go after the racketeer. It's a medical problem. And I was like, wow, he was saying this stuff way back when, because he knew it, right? And then he, there's stories of him going to high schools in the South Bronx in the 60s and saying, he could see kids that were using drugs. And he would tell them like how it destroys your life. So he beat drug addiction, but he died tragically young because he used to smoke. He died of cancer when he was in his 50s. Like, I think I'm older than he was. He died very prematurely at 1967. But when he died, the eulogies, the tributes, everybody, like Muhammad Ali, well, when he was still Cassius Clay. No, sorry, 67, Ali. Everybody came. Everybody paid. This guy was one of the greatest boxers and one of the greatest humans in that sport, meaning nobody hated him. His technique was impeccable. His personality was, charming, and he also kind of he started the whole trend of training. If people know where the Catskill Mountains are, so that's where Mike Tyson was training. Yeah, a lot. So it was the Jewish. It's called the it was the Borscht Belt. But the first guy, there's a reason that Customato was up there, Floyd Patterson. So Tyson talks about training in the Catskills. And so did Rocky Marciano. But the very first guy, Barney Ross, went to Grossinger's, which was a famous resort.
But a lot of time.
1930, yeah, exactly. So he's the first guy to go. It was just because it was a Jewish resort. And all of the legendary Broadway, Fanny Brice and Al Jolson, they would all come watch Barney because he was such a great, to watch those old timers jump rope or just sparring. They would put on a show. Boxing isn't like it used to be. So yeah, if you ever wonder, like, why do all those fighters fight in like upstate New York or the Catskills? It was because Barney Ross started it. He started to go to Grossinger's. Fascinating guy, but also that whole era of the Italians. I'll just go through my little speech real quick. The Irish were the first great generation, fresh off the boat. John L. Sullivan, like the Irish were the first. So how it worked in boxing was the immigrant group that was lowest on the totem. So the Irish, it was back then, it was like that no Irish need apply, So they became the great fighters. And it's also, a fighting culture in Ireland. Then the Jews come, and the Jews become feared, and then the Italians were slightly later. So it was kind of ethnic succession. As you said, you don't find many. You find Israeli Thai boxers. In Israel, I still know some real badass street fighting guys and professional fighters, but there's not many Jewish fighters because of Jewish upward mobility. No Jewish fighter ever wanted his son to become a boxer, because what do we call it now? CTE. But Barney Ross had a smashed nose. A lot of the great old time fighters. I mean, the art of boxing is lost, right? I did a lot of research. They would say, the old time fighters, you'd see cab drivers, and they would always have a left cauliflower ear, not a right one, because slipping, a slip is it's not a duck, and you're just moving an angle, and the guy's punch grazes your ear. So it's a lost art, but every generation, and of course, the black fighters were amazing fighters, and they were, after Jack Johnson, there was a bit of a color barrier. So you did have Henry Armstrong and Joe Louis, but so the lowest guys on the totem pole economically, you got to be hungry. If you're middle class and go into boxing, like I box a bit, I hit the heavy bag. People see me wailing on the heavy bag, and I say, well, it's great because the bag doesn't hit back. But I'm not getting in the ring and getting cauliflower ears or a busted nose, or
like Marvin Hagler said. Marvin Hagler said when he was poor, it was easy. And he said when he got rich, he said it was hard to get up at 4 a.m. and jog in the snow when you're laying in bed in silk pajamas. And by the way, you mentioned about the lost art of boxing. Jack Dempsey, who of course was the heavyweight champ of the world and a spectacular boxer, after he retired, he went across the country. I don't know if it was from California to New York or New York to California, but he went across the country and he visited, I think, about 60 or 70 boxing gyms across the country. And he watched the trainers and he watched the boxers. And he said, no one knows what they're doing. No one. Yeah. He's like, I don't know what is going on here. No one knows anything. So just wanted to...
and Jack Dempsey, by the way, was a great, he had a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. And Jack Dempsey was the referee in one of the McLaren and Ross fights. I mean, we're talking these guys, it really is a lost art. I mean, a beautiful art. And by the way, you get back to Hagler and Hearns. If I hear all these young kids say boxing's bullshit, look at Jake Paul, all these YouTubers are getting into boxing. And, if you really talk to experts, what do you think of Floyd Mayweather? They used to say in the old days, a guy who was 47-0 or 50-0, they would say if you had 0 losses, well, he ain't fought nobody. Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest fighter of all time. Barney Ross thought that, right? I forget how many losses he had, but he lost to LaMotta. If you lost, it just meant you fought everybody out there. So I asked some real experts, I won't name them, what do you think of Mayweather? He's definitely not an all-time greatest fighter. And the fact that he's undefeated means nothing. But we'd say he's a scared fighter. He's fighting scared. I mean, a lot of Mayweather's fights, like when he fought, what's his name? McGregor. He could have knocked him out in the first round. So, but it's like he's such a defensive fighter and he didn't want to put on a show. So a lot of his fights were boring. You know, I hate to say it, he's technically a great fighter, great defensive fighter, but boxing used to be a show. And if you want to see when Hagler fights Hearns, it's what, 4 rounds? But you just see 3 rounds. Sorry, that first round. I always tell people, young kids who go, boxing's bullshit. I say, watch the first round of Hagler Hearns and see how close those 2 men are to dying in the ring. Both of those guys are ready to die. Like, I'm not playing with you. So were Frazier and Ali in the Thriller. Like, these guys, men did die. By the way, getting back to Jewish boxers, Max Baer, who was half Jewish, but he wore the Star of David. Killed.
I don't think he was Jewish.
No, he was part.
Was half Jewish, I think.
Yeah, his part, but he wore the Star of David. Didn't really matter. Jews loved him. Ray Arcel, the greatest trainer of all time, when asked, was Max Baer Jewish? Ray Arcel said, no, I saw him in the shower. I mean, he's not Jewish. He wasn't circumcised. But Jews identified with him. And anyway, he was a real nice guy, a sweet guy.
A very nice guy. Very misunderstood.
But he misunderstood, and Cinderella Man portrayed him as this sadistic
killer, yeah.
And he wasn't. But yeah, he killed a guy in the ring twice. But people don't understand. MMA, I like it. I mean, it's okay. But boxing is a much more lethal sport. There was a study, I'm in Alberta, Canada. I'm sure you know the study, showing how much more brain damage and concussions there are in boxing. MMA it looks more like a savage street fight. You're choking guys unconscious, but it's safer. Boxing is there's a reason they don't have 15-round fights anymore. All these Barney Ross fights were 15 rounds. So were Ali and Frazier. Go look at Boom Boom Mancini. Remember this? I've seen guys die. We've all seen guys die in the ring. Or there was a great documentary, Ring of Fire, about Benny Paret. And anyway, yeah, you know, it's calling him gay. He was calling him maricon, and he just beat him. And there was actually a great Jewish fighter was the ref, who let it go a little too long.
People don't realize the previous fight, Paret had a terrible beating, and he was already ripe to get worse. So that also happened.
So anyway, boxing, it's a beautiful sport. It's a deadly sport, but it's a lost. I think it's, like you said, Dempsey back then was already seeing the diminution. Like, I mean, I watch guys fight and it's like ducking, but slipping. Like, I tried to learn how to box a bit when I was writing about Barney Ross, just to understand it. Like the art of throwing a good left hook, you know. And here's I mean, you're a fighter, or you train. Barney always said this, guys told me, you got to have your left foot pivoting as you throw, as if you're stamping out but it's as if you're stamping out a cigarette. So that's a great image. Yeah. But I see a lot of guys that box and they don't even throw a good left hook. And then the way, like the greatest left hook in our era was Joe Frazier. Wow. He pretty much had one great punch. He didn't have a great jab.
Bummy Davis, Jewish boxer. Yeah. Bummy Davis, great left hook.
I said that to my friend Mike Silver, who was the editor of the Ring magazine, a great boxing writer. And I said, so that, you know, they say Frazier he had one great punch at one left hook. He goes, yeah, but it was the greatest left hook of all time. So what does it matter? Like, he was an incredible fighter with that punch. Anyway, slipping, just research that, you know, ducking. The first impulse when you're in a street fight, or you see guys, I've not really been in street fights, but is to, you know, pull back, to duck. But the slip, it takes such. So when I show old timers, Barney Ross, Jimmy McLaren, and Tony Canzoneri, I'll say, what do you see? And they'll say, just see how relaxed he is. To be that confident of your skills. So you're not pulling away from the punch or ducking, you're slipping it. Just, how would you describe a slip? You're a doctor. It's like a fraction. It's just a little turn, but then you're also positioned to hit a counter. But I think slipping is a lost art. So there's all these great things that you used to see in the old time fights. And I also think fight fans aren't even, boxing fans just want to see a knockout. They don't appreciate the fact that these guys like Jake Paul and these celebrity fights are drawing so much attention, just kind of to show you how poor the talent pool is. There still are really good fighters. Obviously Canelo. I mean, the Mexican fighters. Tyson Fury is a really interesting fighter because he doesn't look, you know, he's a killer, but he looks kind of like a bit flabby or whatever, but that's a scary. So, I mean, there are really good fighters out there. Unfortunately, I think part of the reason is we have to pay so much damn money. the fact that it's all pay-per-view. So my dad, for example, and you're probably your dad, grew up with the Friday night Gillette fights, 50s, I guess it was. And you'd see, so if you could see the free fights, and we all remember Wild World of Sports, guys of our age. Can you imagine? We got to see Muhammad Ali for free. Remember, I cried when Leon Spinks, I was a little boy, and when Leon Spinks beat Muhammad Ali, I was just crying. I was in tears.
I remember that.
But how did we see it? It was on free TV.
Yeah.
So
well, listen, I just want to tell you, Doug, thank you for this interview. I don't want to keep you too long, but we covered a ton of stuff. I loved it. We have a lot of common interests, so I especially.
I hope this wasn't too long. You might have to cut it up.
It's perfect. And in the little description under it, I'll put your website and stuff so people can get your books. And I'll tell you right now, this guy's a great writer. So if any of these topics interest you, get his book. So thank you, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on, and I hope people will check out stuff. And if you do nothing, if you don't even want to read or buy my books, go on YouTube for free and just look up some of the old time fighters, Jimmy McLaren and Barney Ross, and just look at the beauty of that sport.
I agree.
Appreciate it, man.